and comes to the President of the United States can't cut it in a democracy. So we're going to investigate what that really means and who Sekulow is speaking to, what cases need to be made, and what the American people need to know to make up their own minds.
All right, I'll be watching, Laura.
Well, thanks, Don. So let's get to it, everyone. This is a CNN special hour, The White House in Crisis, the impeachment inquiry. I'm Laura Coates. Tonight, we're going to dig deep into every angle of this fast-moving impeachment investigation. Our headlines include a new and extraordinary effort to protect the Ukraine whistleblower, the Democrats expanding their inquiry with new subpoenas for officials at the Pentagon, and the Office of Management and Budget. And we're going to preview tomorrow's star witness. It's the ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, a $1 million Trump donor who, by the way, is set to testify before not one, not two, but three committees on Capitol Hill in the morning. But first, President Trump, as usual, was busy playing defense at the White House. And CNN's Sarah Murray takes us through the biggest developments of the day.
You can't impeach a president for doing a great job.
President Trump kicks off his week under pressure from an impeachment inquiry and raging at the Democrats. But he says he's thriving.
What they did to this country is unthinkable. And it's lucky that I'm the president because I guess, I don't know what, a lot of people said very few people could handle it. I sort of thrive on it.
But while Trump claims he's thriving, we learned today that the House Intelligence Committee is taking extreme measures to protect the whistleblower from a president itching to learn his identity.
And this country has to find out who that person was because that person's a spy, in my opinion.
And sources tell CNN there are growing concerns about the whistleblower's safety. It's still unclear when the whistleblower might talk to lawmakers, but the committee is considering using an off-site location, limiting staff and members who could be present, or even disguising the whistleblower's image or voice. And today, another crack in the Republican force field around the president. Ohio Senator Rob Portman took a measured approach, criticizing Trump's conduct on the call with the Ukrainian president. The president should not have raised the Biden issue on that call. Period. It's not appropriate for a president to engage a foreign government in an investigation of a political opponent. But there was a big but. I don't view it as an impeachable offense. That strategy held up better than House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy's.
You watched what the president said. He's not saying China's investigate.
Who apparently missed Trump saying this just 4 days ago.
Likewise, China should start an investigation into the Bidens. Because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine.
As for the actual impeachment investigation, the House committees fired off a new round of subpoenas to the Pentagon and the Office of Management and Budget today. Democrats are seeking more information about the decision to freeze aid to Ukraine at the same time Trump and Rudy Giuliani were pushing for investigations into the Biden family. House Democrats also threatened to subpoena 3 associates of Giuliani after they missed a deadline to provide documents to the Hill. Today, 2 of them, Ukrainian-American businessman Lev Parnas and his business partner Igor Fruman, responded via their attorney, John Dowd, the same John Dowd who once represented President Trump. He said a response would take time. Your request for documents and communications is overly broad and unduly burdensome, Dowd wrote. This, in combination with requiring immediate responses, leads me to the inescapable conclusion that the Democratic committee members' intent is to harass, intimidate, and embarrass my clients.
And Sarah Murray joins me now. Sarah, Gordon Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, is going to testify tomorrow in front of 3 committees. You got the House, Intelligence, Foreign Affairs, and also Oversight. And we all saw his name pop up in those damning text messages. So tell us, why is he so significant that he's going to have the attention of 3 congressional committees tomorrow?
That's right, and he's going to be interesting for a number of reasons. One, he was heavily involved in the run-up of this call between President Trump and the Ukrainian president, trying to get it off the ground at a time when Ukraine was pressing for a face-to-face meeting with President Trump, and President Trump was holding back that meeting in exchange for investigation. So he knows a little bit about what that quid pro quo may have looked like behind the scenes, certainly more than what we've seen in the text messages. But also, when you see these text messages play out, you can see him discussing with other diplomats diplomats who are concerned that there's another quid pro quo going on. They're concerned that the president is withholding this military aid in exchange for these investigations. And you really begin to see Gordon Sondland's tone change. And we know a couple things happened during the course of these text messages. We know from Wall Street Journal reporting he had a conversation with Republican Senator Ron Johnson, where he told Ron Johnson, essentially, the president is holding up Ukrainian military aid in exchange for these investigations. The president talks to Ron Johnson and says, no, that's not what's going on. And all of a sudden, in text messages with other diplomats, Gordon Sondland saying, absolutely not. The president has been crystal clear, no quid pro quo. So if I'm a member of this committee, I want to know what gave him this impression when he talked to Ron Johnson, who got to him, what changed his view of the situation in those couple of days between those conversations and those text messages. Certainly there's a lot to be gained from Sondland's testimony tomorrow.
And of course, answering that question, why'd you say call me? I mean, that's, to me,
Absolutely.
a big question.
Why don't you want a record?
Why did you want this in writing? Thank you, Sarah. You know, let's now unravel some of this with two of the smartest guys I know, CNN chief legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin and CNN political analyst David Gregory. David, Jeffrey paid me to say that about him, but it means something for you as well. I'm going to tell you. So, Jeffrey, I'm going to ask you, Sondland's testimony tomorrow will be a really big moment in this inquiry, and his name is all over those text messages. Let me read one of them with the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine, Bill Taylor. As I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with the political campaign. Then Gordon Sondland responds, Bill, I believe you are incorrect about President Trump's intentions. The president has been crystal clear, no quid pro quos of any kind. The president is trying to evaluate whether Ukraine is truly going to adopt the transparency and reforms that President Zelensky promised during his campaign. Now, I got to ask you, Jeffrey, what is the significance of that exchange and how important? And by the way, it sounds very sanitized.
Well, yes. I mean, that doesn't read like a text. It reads like the back of your credit card bill. I mean, it's very carefully stated. And it comes after more informal conversations several days earlier where they are, talking about where Wilson, the diplomat, is saying, like, what is this quid pro quo? Why is this a good way to conduct foreign policy? Where then he says, call me, to sort of end the recorded part of their exchange. And then after something happens, and we don't know.
Hours go by the way.
Hours go by between
exchange.
Those two, why are we doing this? The quid pro quo. He says there was no quid pro quo in that very stylized, formal email, which doesn't sound like any of his other emails. So certainly one of the questions the congressmen are going to want to ask tomorrow is, what made you write that email, and did you have help? What prompted you to write in such a different style than you had written previously?
I mean, David, everyone I know says quid pro quo in every sentence they've ever said to a friend via text message, right? But, I mean, I'll note that it took Sondland about 5 hours to answer that text. And when he finally did, we're talking about it sounds sanitized, it sounds scrubbed. But is it still damning now that he has essentially cleaned up that earlier exchange?
Well, I think it is, because you've got two camps here. You've got those who are inside the tent and those who are outside. And those who are outside are professional diplomats with real experience in international affairs. Sondland does not have that. He's a wealthy guy who's in the hotel business, who gave a lot of money to Trump, despite his earlier reservations, and becomes an ambassador to the EU. And people should remember there's lots of people who are named ambassadors who have no diplomatic experience. He has none. And what he's doing here is he's carrying the president's brief here and saying, oh, no, there's no quid pro quo. But he's also been involved in what is this shadow agenda here by the president, by Rudy Giuliani, because when they say corruption, they mean Joe Biden. Right. That's what they mean when it comes to Ukraine. And everybody else has to get on board. And I do think what's so telling, I wonder how helpful he's going to be in questioning by members of Congress. But what is so telling is that you have the likes of Bill Taylor who are really saying this is bad, this stinks, I don't like how this looks, it's bad policy, and that he cuts it off. Bill Taylor knows enough to make a record, even though they're texting. We should point out, I guess, in the post-Hillary Clinton world, there's more people in the diplomatic corps who are texting. He knew enough to make a record here, and Sondland wants to cut that short. That's telling, and that's where I think the investigation focuses.
Maybe you want to hear from Bill Taylor. I mean, if he did that with the intention of breaking a record, what does that say to you?
Well, you certainly want to hear from Taylor, because Taylor is one of these professionals, as David said, who is horrified by the idea of using American foreign policy to gather political dirt. What all of these investigations are trying to do is establish a chronology of what happened, particularly with regard to this money, the money that Congress appropriated, and for reasons that remain mysterious, does not get to the Ukrainians for quite some time. And there are these exchanges that suggest very strongly that the reason it doesn't go to the Ukrainians is because they hadn't come across with the political dirt yet.
Right.
American taxpayer dollars in return for dirt on Joe Biden. That's certainly the way this looks. But the Democrats on the committee need to establish a chronology with the text messages, the emails, and starting tomorrow, the testimony.
I want to go through that chronology as well. Jeffrey, David, stick around. We have a lot more to discuss, and I want to definitely hear from you, because coming up, I'll make my case about what might be today's most important development. And by the way, it happened 200 miles away from where back with me. Now, we're going to talk about today's decision by a federal judge here in New York that might have a huge impact on the investigations into President Trump. Now, this decision could finally clear the way for all of us to see whatever Trump is hiding in his tax returns, because today, Judge Victor Marrero ruled that Trump's tax returns can be turned over to a New York State grand jury. And he dismissed the president's claim that the occupant of the White House enjoys absolute immunity from criminal process of any kind. In fact, the judge called that claim an overreach of executive power and, quote, repugnant to the nation's governmental structure and constitutional values. Now, the Manhattan DA wants to know if Trump or his company falsified business records in connection with those hush money payments made during the 2016 presidential campaign to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. Now, both women allege they had affairs with Trump, who denied the allegations. Now, Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen, admits paying some of the hush money on Trump's behalf. He's now serving time in federal prison after pleading guilty in a case concerning those very payments. An attorney for the president immediately appealed today's ruling, and Trump and his lawyers have one main argument. The president of the United States is untouchable. As long as he's got on those ruby slippers of the presidency, the so-called wicked witch hunts of the justice system can't touch him. That's also called above the law, by the way. Now, the president's team is clinging to Justice Department guidelines, and I stress the word guidelines, which say that a sitting president can't be indicted, can't be criminally prosecuted. And here's where Judge Marrero's ruling today could have far-reaching implications. Remember that old DOJ guideline that says you can't indict a sitting president? How often did you hear that? Well, after today, that guideline may be all bark and no bite. Because here's a key part of his opinion. It reads, the court rejects the DOJ memo's position. It concludes that better calibrated alternatives to absolute presidential immunity exist, yielding a more appropriate balance between, on the one hand, the burdens that subjecting the president to criminal proceedings would impose on his ability to perform constitutional duties, and on the other, the need to promote the court's legitimate interests and functions in ensuring effective law enforcement attendant to the proper and fair administration of justice. Now, he then addressed the question of a president asserting immunity, writing, it should be justified by exacting reasons of momentous public interest, like national security, and be reviewable by a court of law. Above all, he writes, its effective should not be to shield the president from all legal process, especially in circumstances where it may appear that a claim of generalized immunity is invoked more on personal than on official grounds, and work to place the president above the law. Now, what does all that mean? Well, in other words, Judge Marrero is saying President Trump is not above the law. And the constitutional mandates of checks and balances and separation of powers, well, those trump absolute immunity. Now, President Trump's attorney, Jay Sekulow, was on Chris Cuomo's show tonight, and here's what he had to say about the president's tax returns.
But the bigger issue for people at home, Jay, is
hold it.
Why not just turn over the taxes?
This wasn't just an appeal.
Why not just turn over the taxes?
This wasn't. Well, we're not required to. When the people elected the president to become the president, he had not issued his tax return. It's not required in the Constitution.
So
you think
what?
we should have enough? Why don't we say we? Because the Constitution doesn't require it, Chris. But let me talk to you about.
But that doesn't mean the Constitution says you shouldn't.
Back again with Jeffrey Toobin and David Gregory. Now, David, I want to ask you, the language this judge has used is pretty stark. I mean, what are the implications, what you see, for Trump's impeachment inquiry now?
Well, I'll stay away from the law and raise the question of whether this gets us any closer to learning what's in those tax returns. And it appears that the answer is not really, because even if there is an order that they should be released, they may not be released publicly, which is something that we'll have to wait for. I think the one piece of that is, I think, is both a constitutional question, but becomes a political question, is we have a means to hold a president accountable for abusing office and abusing power, and that is the impeachment process. The problem is it's such a political process and seldom yields the result of removing a president from office unless there is enough bipartisanship to reach such a conclusion, which in this day and age of political polarization seems impossible. Those are at least a couple of the political questions.
But I mean, David, on this issue, I mean, the idea of the taxes has been long brewing. I mean, is this really about taxes, politically speaking, or is this more about the president flexing his executive power in a way that he's trying to say, look, you in what army?
Right. I think it's a much bigger issue, and perhaps the Supreme Court will visit this again on the question of whether a president can be indicted. But there's larger battles here about presidential authority, about executive power that predate Donald Trump as president. And some of this is the judiciary speaking, but Congress has a role to finally do its job and assert some more prerogative and some more power in this country. And that's one of the fights that's at issue here in impeachment in this regard, but it plays out in national security, plays out in the role of using force overseas, the power that was given to the president after 9/11 that Congress has not authorized or has not taken up the debate again.
Now, Jeffrey, I have to mention this. Of course, this is really big. We remember that the DOJ guideline was used by Mueller to justify why he could not pursue charges, why it may have been the basis and the predicate for why the exploration of Part 2 of that 400-plus page Mueller report. I mean, what do you see as the biggest deal here, thinking about a judge saying those guidelines, well, thank you very much, but it's not the Constitution?
Right. But I think it's important to point out that this case is not about the prosecution of Donald Trump. What the Trump's lawyers are arguing is that if you have this DOJ policy against prosecuting a president, you also can't subject the president to compulsory process in a criminal investigation. You can't subpoena him as well as not prosecute him. And what Judge Marrero says is, no. Even if you accept the policy of no prosecution, you can still treat the president like a witness who has to produce documents and has to produce, in this case, his tax returns. And remember, there's several cases all over the country about the president's tax returns. There's the Ways and Means Committee, which has its own process to get it. In California, there's a law that says you can't go on the presidential ballot unless you produce your tax returns. You have this New York State prosecution investigation here. All of them are aimed at getting the tax returns. None have succeeded so far. I think one or more are going to succeed eventually.
And of course, remember, we're talking about the case maybe going up to the Supreme Court. We know that it's the president's Supreme Court in many ways. The consequential decision to not allow Merrick Garland even to get a hearing in the past administration, and now he's been able to seat more than one person. I wonder if it will have an impact, frankly, on what goes down. We'll have to follow the story along. You know, President Trump is upsetting his Republican defenders with his abrupt decision on Syria. But they're awfully quiet. I mean, crickets when it comes to the Ukraine scandal. So why the utter lack of consistency? We'll break that down next. Welcome back. This is a CNN special hour, the White House in crisis. Now, today, Republicans on Capitol Hill are actually outraged with the President of the United States. But here's the catch. It has nothing to do with his request for China and Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 election. The reason they're so angry? The president's hasty and confusing decision to pull U.S. troops out of Syria. Now, it seems like some Republican senators are only taking the president seriously half the time. Like, take what Marco Rubio said about Trump's calls for China to investigate Joe Biden.
I don't think it's a real request. I think he did it to gig you guys. I think he did it to provoke you to ask me and others and get outraged by it. Like I said, I mean, he plays it like a violin and everybody falls right into it, but that's not a real request.
It's not a real request. But when Trump announces pulling out troops from Syria, well, that's real to Senator Rubio. He said it's a grave mistake. And Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, well, he's actually running ads that say he will lead Republican efforts to stop President Trump from being removed from office. And by the way, that's not even considering what an impeachment inquiry will find. But Trump's decision on Syria, well, here's his strongly worded statement. A precipitous withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria would only benefit Russia, Iran, and the Assad regime, and it would increase the risk that ISIS and other terrorist groups regroup. Now, McConnell says Trump's decision benefits U.S. enemies. Well, that's stunning. And Senator Lindsey Graham, well, he had no problems with Trump asking Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden over debunked claims.
I have zero problems with this phone call. There is no quid pro quo here.
Zero problem. But Trump's troop withdrawal from Syria, that's a big problem for Senator Graham. So big that he called the president's favorite TV show to say it.
This impulsive decision by the president has undone all the gains we've made, thrown the region into further chaos. Iran is licking their chops. And if I'm an ISIS fighter, I've got a second lease on life.
Senator.
I hope I'm making myself clear how short-sighted and irresponsible this decision is, in my view.
Just so we're clear, it's an impulsive action that's short-sighted and has ramifications about foreign diplomatic relations. Okay, just a lot to discuss here. Joining me now, Manu Raju, Caitlin Collins, and Shane Harris. I'm glad to have you all here. Caitlin, you know, a big difference between how key Republicans are reacting to the president's Syria withdrawal and his calls for foreign interference from Ukraine and China. So, tell me, why the split here?
Yeah, and they're making sure to separate the two, saying that they don't interconnect them. If they are going to criticize the president over this decision on Syria, that doesn't mean that they're not going to still give him cover over those calls with Ukraine that have now come under scrutiny. So that'll be something to watch. But also what's interesting is as the president is infuriating some of these Republicans, who a lot of them probably should have seen this coming because it is something the president promised on the campaign trail. It is something he talked about last December because it, of course, led to the resignation of the defense secretary at the time and other top officials. What's going to be interesting is the president's fate in not that long potentially could be in a lot of these Republicans' hands, and whether or not they hold the support for the president as he's likely facing this impeachment inquiry. That's something I heard a lot from White House officials today. They're going to be watching how some of these key Senate Republicans are criticizing the president over this, and of course, whether or not he decides to recalibrate, as you saw him do a little bit today when he then went on Twitter, pivoted slightly and said he is going to try to restrain Turkey, though he didn't exactly go into detail of how he's going to do so.
Well, compartmentalization may be the name of the game here. Manu, I got to ask you, why do the Republican senators feel it's okay to attack the president on Syria, but they want to give the cover on election interference the way that Caitlin's talking about? Is it really a matter of compartmentalizing, or is something different here that we're all missing?
Well, Ukraine matter and the aftermath and the scandal and now the move for impeachment really threatens the heart of the Trump presidency, could ultimately undercut his ability to win re-election, and in the most extreme circumstance could lead to the removal of the president from office, although at the moment, of course, there's no indication that the Republicans would vote to convict him in the Senate. But nevertheless, by agreeing with Democrats that he was over the line when it comes to Ukraine, that what his conduct was unbecoming of a president, that it potentially fits the standards of high crimes and misdemeanors, that would be a bridge too far for many Republicans. They realize that at the end of the day, the fight over impeachment in the House, the impeachment investigation, for the most part, is going to be a partisan affair. You're going to have to pick your team, essentially, Republicans or Democrats. Now, on this issue, they view it as it's a bit easier. They're a bit safer ground. It doesn't threaten Trump's presidency in any way. They view it as more of a policy matter to break from the president on. And you've seen that from time to time in the Trump presidency, whether it's over the Trump tariffs, whether it's over his criticism of NATO, whether it's over here his move on Syria. So you're seeing that a very occasional break from the president on foreign policy grounds. But when it comes to matters that could rock the core of his presidency, that's completely different, Laura.
And yet there's still the same theme here, foreign policy considerations. And maybe I'm being skeptical here when I say maybe it's just enough cover to show that you're being objective, to have a little bit of a give and take on your criticism. But Shane, let's go to you. Shane, the president needs Republican support on the impeachment front. We know this. So will his decision on Syria cost him that support?
Well, it's a risky strategy to pursue when you need these Republicans to side with you as jurors, and he's counting on them to acquit him if it does go to an impeachment. He has picked the one thing that will unite Republicans in the Senate against him, which is this issue of supporting the Kurds. For many of these senators, this is about a couple of things. One, it is supporting a group of stalwart allies that spilled their blood, that died. Dismantling the caliphate is something that President Trump likes to take credit for. And this also speaks to American integrity and dependability. These senators are worried about how are our allies going to be looking at us in the future. When we go to war, we do it as a coalition. The United States doesn't go to war alone. And so if you wanted to pick this one place to really give the Republicans a chance to stand up, this is it. And that seems to me a pretty risky strategy when you're looking into a possible impeachment trial.
You know, it's a great point to think about what that looks like and why that would be the case. Now, Caitlin, you know, you're reporting that the White House has been struggling with an impeachment strategy overall. So the president, his campaign is taking the lead or attempting to. So why is the campaign in a stronger position on this than, say, the White House?
It's interesting, and it's kind of something that's confusing people in the White House who don't understand why they haven't been able to develop a clear, effective message since Nancy Pelosi launched that formal impeachment inquiry during that. Something that aides have pushed back on in the White House, saying it's not a real impeachment inquiry until Democrats bring it up for the vote, which, of course, Democrats have disputed. But something you're seeing inside the White House is as simple as who is defending the president on television. If you watched on Sunday, not a single White House official was out there making the president's case. Instead, they left it up to Republican lawmakers who, for the people who watched, could see that they struggled, saying the president was just kidding when he was talking about having China investigate the Bidens, an argument that even the White House hasn't made. But instead, you're seeing the campaign really take a lead here, where they're hosting a conference call with reporters today, pushing their talking points. And while at times those talking points were not completely accurate, they see it as they're at least trying to defend the president, trying to put some kind of message out there, which you haven't really seen a concerted effort like that coming from the White House yet, which is frustrating people.
I hope it doesn't come down to that old adage again, literally versus seriously. Manu, Caitlin, Shane, thank you each for being a part of the show. You know, President Trump claims